everyone, and welcome to Conversation with Iris, a Zoomcast and podcast series on migration, diversity, and citizenship available on YouTube and all major podcast platforms. It is a great pleasure to host Dr. Sarah Louise Nash for a new episode of Conversation with Iris. Sarah is a political scientist based at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, and she's currently holder of a Marie Curie individual fellowship. Her first book, Negotiating Migration in the Context of Climate Change, International Policy and Discourse, was published in 2019 with Bristol University Press. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much.
What I would like to talk to you today is very much about the focus of your research, about the policy encounter between climate change and human mobility. Can you tell us about when this encounter started and why?
Sure. So I guess actually in my book, I'm a little bit unusual in that where I start and take as a starting point is for most people maybe not the start of this process, right? The starting point of my book is actually the first time that migration was mentioned in an agreed upon text of the climate change negotiations. So for many, this would be kind of the end point of like a policy study, right? Getting something agreed upon. But I chose this to be the start. And I guess that has kind of a couple of reasons. Firstly, I'm looking at kind of negotiations in two different ways at the same time, right? I'm seeing these area of climate and migration as a social construct, right? So it's shaped by all the ideas flowing into these spaces. It's shaped by the people presenting these ideas. It's shaped by the moments they're being discussed in. So the institutional, the geographical moments, the institutional spaces where these are taking place. But it's, so it's on the one side, this really kind of official, technocratic, bureaucratic negotiation. On the other side, this kind of personal negotiation of through these debates and documents, etc. So again, I took this as a starting point because it marked the beginning of lots of migration actors really intensively taking part in these spaces that are kind of the climate negotiation world. But also looking at that kind of technical negotiation kind of level of things, the article that in this agreed upon text is to do with increasing understanding, coordination, cooperation on climate change, induced displacement, migration, and planned relocation. So it's very much a starting point of work to move forward. It's starting off trying to understand these phenomena better within in this policy space.
When was it?
It was 2010 in the Cancun Adaptation Framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
So who was around the table?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of agreeing this text, it would have been states, right? State parties to the Framework Convention. But in the background in these spaces, obviously, so many other people around there as well. The International Organization for Migration are there. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees always send representatives. There's academics like me who always go to these meetings and follow them in the back and, bring inputs to help negotiators understand as well. And I think that's the last kind of important point why this text and this meeting was a starting point, is that the wording sounds really nuanced, right? You look at, displacement, migration and planned relocation, I think kind of, wow, they've really got this. But actually reports coming out from people there were that they put all these words in there because they didn't really understand the differences and wanted understanding to be built up about all of them and about how these interact with climate. So for me, it showed that this was really a starting point and not the end of a really long, journey to get to a really fine wording.
Thank you, Sarah. I was wondering if you could tell us briefly, what was the content of this conversation? In what ways migration become interesting or relevant in the discussion around climate?
So maybe to look at it particularly in the context of the climate negotiations, because that's also a very specific world, right? There's kind of three broad areas of work, two of which are much older. So the first is climate mitigation, so basically trying to stop climate and climate impacts from happening. The second would be adaptation. So that's kind of the recognition that there will be some impacts of climate change that we can't stop, and that we need to kind of learn how to live with those. And that's where the migration discussion actually started. And it was, okay, well, we see people are moving, we see differences in mobility patterns. How does this link to this adaptation discourse? But actually, since 2010, there's been a shift within the negotiations, and now it's anchored within this third area of work, which is loss and damages, which kind of goes that step further. It says, okay, there'll even be some impacts that we can't adapt to. We can't like change our living situations to be able to deal with these impacts anymore. Things will be lost, things will be damaged, either, you know, financial losses and damage, or also non-financial things like, you know, a home and cultural things. So that's now where this discourse is really anchored, I mean, institutionally, but also I think in terms of how it's spoken about in the climate negotiations. So that's seen a definite shift that we've seen over the past years.
So if I understand well, at the beginning, your focus was very much on the UN level of this conversation, and your more recent work is also including a more closer attention to the role of national governments, particularly within the European space. I was wondering how the conversation on climate and migration changed between the UN level and the national levels, and how some of the discussion and agreements that happen at the UN level is translated in national conversations.
Yeah, so actually it's this difference that motivated me to move my research into looking at this nation state level. And I think it's important also to say that I focus very much on the global north in my work. So I actually work on European nation states, which I've not found anyone else that does this at the discourse political level yet. And that for me, this was just kind of a glaring omission in the literature, right? These states are all around the table at the climate negotiations, and they're, you know, they're giving opinions on what they think we should do about climate and displacement migration issues, and they're, you know, heading up initiatives such as the National Initiative. You know, Norway and Switzerland played a huge role in that, for example. The German government have also been involved in initiatives, etc. So these states are there, right? They're around the tables in the international spaces, but there's not a huge amount of discourse on these issues happening at the nation state politics level. There's not like policies being made in Austria, where I live, on climate change and migration. So I found this really interesting to look at the differences between these levels. And I think what I've noticed in, you know, in the examples that I have, for example, some parliaments have had debates around climate and migration. So there's transcripts, etc., to analyse. And I think it's that the tone is very different. So I'm used to this like technocratic, bureaucratic, looking at the commas, but not necessarily debating whether there's a link between climate and migration, right? Like in the international space and the climate negotiations, this has become a bit of a given. But if we're moving to a, you know, given European national state parliament, actually they're still having these discussions. And I think you've got to go through a lot of more layers of like fears and worries concerning, you know, borders of security, of anti-migration worries, to, you know, you've got to deal with all of those at the same time in these discussions, and that's been quite challenging. First as a researcher, because you're like, well, what policies do you want? What I found as well is that yeah, there's not that huge amount of knowledge on the links. So there's, you know, Green parties using the kind of figure of a future potential climate refugee to try and argue for more climate policy and climate action kind of now, and at the same time far right kind of denying climate and the links between climate and migration, but also wanting to put up walls to stop people coming here. So there's this kind of really interesting mixture of discourses going on there that is much harder to penetrate, but I think gives interesting insights into what's happening at this level.
It seems like that at some level, even among liberal parties or politicians, there is an implicit use of the fear of refugees coming as a way of creating political capital for climate, interventions. Very much, I mean, seen from the outside, the conversation around climate and migration was very much focused around some figures that came out about, you know, the environmental refugees or the climate refugees, and the label has changed over time. And I think, in a sense, some of the conversation was knocked down when the prediction that initially had come out about the number of the millions of people that were going to be displaced by climate didn't come up to be proved to be true, at least not in the size that was expected. It's been, the fear of the mobility, the fear of displacement because of climate reason. And then, there is only an issue about how do they find a climate-specific driver of mobility. I guess it's not easy to identify. Do you see that this fear of mobility to be at the front or actually hidden in the conversation around climate? The fact that they don't want actually displacee reaching out for northern countries, for example.
Yeah, I think it's a complete core part of the debate, maybe not in like the elite policy spaces, but if you're looking at kind of the broader debates, this kind of securitization of people on the move is front and center. And I think, you mentioned like figures and potential numbers of people who would be moving in the context of climate change. It's actually become one of the main parts of my job, has been talking about what these numbers are and explaining why they're probably not that accurate. It's not what I've set out to do with my career, but it's something I've been asked constantly. And I think a worrying trend I'm seeing is these numbers just keep getting bigger and bigger, and brought out repeatedly and then reproduced uncritically by, quite highly recognized media sources that really should know better than to reproduce a press release from a think tank that has come up with one of these numbers, for example. But that's what we're seeing happening a lot. And I think that there's so many problematic, aspects to that. One is just methodological rigor, right? Often lots of these numbers just don't have much of a method behind them, or they're based on quite sound computer-based modeling, but that don't take political or social dynamics into consideration. So lots of these are really problematic and then utilized in order to kind of stoke these fires of fear.
I think you touched on a very important point. Recently, when the IOM World Migration Report came out, there was again this discussion about, the numbers of the broader figure about the migrants in the world, but also when the UNHCR come up with the latest figure of refugees, it looks like that unless you can claim that there is a continuous increase in the size of the displaced people population, you don't get attention. So somehow these agendas between those who fear migrants and refugees to come and those who try to mobilize for the rights of migrants and refugees seems to find a strange terrain in which they meet, isn't it? I mean, you were talking about early on around this idea of and I know that your Mary Skłodowska-Curie project is around this idea of climate diplomacy. It's and probably the latest, largest event of around this climate diplomacy was recently in Glasgow, the COP26 closed just a few weeks ago. And I was wondering, at least as an observer from outside, it seems to me that the issue of migration was not very present, at least not in the main part of the conversation. What do you think about this? Is it true, or was just my impression?
Yeah, so I was in Glasgow following these discussions. Yeah, I mean, it's true that in terms of the content of the negotiations at this COP, migration wasn't hugely prominent, but that wasn't also a huge surprise. Institutionally at the moment, migration and displacement are being considered under a so-called task force for displacement that has been set up under the loss and damage framework. And they're in the middle of a work program at the moment. So there's no reason for a decision to be made by the COP at the moment on that work, simply because it's ongoing. But that is still happening there and it's still being talked about. But if you look at kind of actually what was happening within the meeting, the side events and the people hanging around in the corridors of the negotiation halls, all of the big organizations were there. So UNHCR were there hanging out, the International Organization for Migration and their representatives were there. I think the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, I saw representatives. So lots of the players were in the rooms and in the side rooms, and side events were happening. So the debate is definitely ongoing. And I think if we're looking ahead to kind of coming COPs, it's not an issue that's going away just because it wasn't in the negotiation text this time. At this COP, a lot happened around loss and damage, which, as I mentioned before, is where migration and displacement are being dealt with. It's never been this prominent an issue before, as it was in Glasgow. And there's a couple of processes coming up in the next few years that I think could be, quite prominent and quite important. One is being just a dialogue around loss and damage that was promised. It was a concession given in the negotiations because lots of parties wanted actually finance for loss and damage, and that couldn't be, brought through negotiations. So a dialogue has been proposed instead. And I think their migration and displacement will definitely be talked about as key parts of this area of work.
You mentioned the main international actors, especially coming from the migration refugee side, so IOM and the UNHCR. And I was wondering if you can detect any significant difference in the sort of agendas around these encounters between climate change and mobility. Do they push for different sort of priorities, or they really work around the same key points?
I think maybe to foreground my answer to that, it's important to say that I think both of these organisations are starting to shift slightly in how they work on this issue. So until now, there's been quite a lot of really technical work happening from both organisations who have, built up a profile working on climate change. Since, in 2010, there wasn't much of that in either of these organisations. And since then, that's been built up. But in recent years, both have kind of in staffing changes, some things you wouldn't necessarily look at, right? But the area has become more high profile. So there's kind of much more high profile within the organisation, staff members now working on both of these issues. And I think that's so they've elevated it within their areas of work. So in that sense, both are quite similar. Both organisations have been kind of scaling that up. In terms of the differences, you can definitely see differences in the language. So for example, the International Organization for Migration talk about environmental migration when they work in this space, or environmental and climate change in recent years. But they include, forced migration within that migration word, whereas you hear other organizations maybe using the word displacement instead. So you can see definitely a bit of like maneuvering to have issues within certain mandates, I think. It's kind of a technical move there from both. But also these organizations have worked incredibly closely together. So there's been a kind of informal network called the Advisory Group on Climate Change and Human Mobility, which has basically been a kind of elite Geneva-based grouping of people from these kind of organizations working together to come up with common messaging around human mobilities that they then bring into those COP spaces. So often these organizations have been putting out like briefings, 2-3 page documents, which, really push the same agenda. And I think for many, this has been one of the reasons why they've been so successful about working in the climate negotiation space, is that it wasn't too cluttered with too many different messages. So they were able to kind of come up with some common stuff and really push that there.
Thank you very much. Around the link between mobility and climate change, in some of the discussion, the emphasis seems to be very much on traumatic, sudden events, emergencies. In other cases, that is much more about, the slow-moving processes that produce then mobility. I was wondering, in terms of the attention that the international organization working on migration on this issue put, what are the aspects of the climate crisis that seems to somehow attract more the attention from a migration governance perspective rather than from the climate side?
That's really interesting, actually. I've not thought about trying to break that down much before. I guess, so sometimes it's a little bit differentiated. For example, we've got the platform and disaster displacement that's really quite prominent and really focusing on those kind of sudden impact events that are, they don't use the word natural disasters, but kind of climate and weather related. So they're working on that kind of category, whereas obviously there's been renewed focus on kind of slow onset events, which I think has been much more difficult to deal with before, actually, for kind of two interrelated reasons. One is that it's really difficult to find data and statistics on it, because people make decisions about their mobility at different points, right? So you don't have this sudden movement of people where you can count the people who are moving. It's much more spread out. And secondly, because it's often very much a kind of future conditional thing that's going to be happening, maybe some point. We don't yet know what adaptation efforts are going to happen and to what degree they will be successful. We don't know whether people will decide, okay, I want to utilize migration as a way of coping with this, or whether they'll say, no, actually, I want to stay here in my home. So there's so many unknowns, and this kind of, time perspective looking into the future makes it really hard to work on. But I would say it's coming more and more.
Oh, thanks a lot, Sarah. Final question, and you mentioned before, in a sense, the role, your focus is mostly on the global north and the way they negotiated, but clearly, if you think about COP26, in Glasgow, a big issue is also about this tension between some countries taking a sort of grand moral standings and asking the people in the countries in the global south to accepting cats, etc. We know that the governance of migration is that the global government migration is a continuous tension between what we ask the transit country or the country in the global south to do in terms of blocking people from moving, etc. So I was wondering if this tension between the global north and the global south, when it comes to migration and climate, is something that is it visible? Is there a block of northern countries that push for a specific agenda around the climate and migration, or there are sort of different positionings that we need to pay attention to?
So I'm not aware of like a particular block of countries pushing for anything, or pushing for, you know, something not to happen either, for blocking. That's not something I'm aware of. And I think the tension is not as easily visible, partly because I think, you know, most research and policy making, like regional or local policy making that's happening on this is located in the global south, but most of the thinking that's being done about it is people located in the global north. And I think that's why I wanted to turn this whole thing around and look at the global north. You know, there's institutions and researchers who are really active in these debates, but where actually we don't have any knowledge about what the discourse is like and how it's developing here, right? So I think...
Thanks a lot. Thanks for sharing with us those thoughts. It's been extremely informative and it's also extremely topical. Thank you.
Thank you very much.